So now we're going to go to the panel discussion. So I'm going to pass over to Hia and Chris, who are going to host this part. Thank you all for writing your questions in Pigeonhole. There are quite a few up there already, I think, but if you'd like to ask any more as the panel discussion is going on, then the link is in the chat. And yeah, over to you both.
Hello. So we've been receiving some great questions on Pigeonhole, and thank you to all three speakers for such informative chat. So I think I'll start off with the question which was voted the most times, and that's for Alistair. So the first question is, how can you target only the virus or bacteria with minimal damage to the host cells?
Yeah, well, the truth in that is you can't, right? Because we're taking a chemotherapy approach to basically disrupting these membranes. One of the key things that you've got to do is actually then tone your light delivery. So one way that I use to describe what we've made is talking about light switches. In your home, you've probably got an on-off light switch. I've got one here on my desk, off and on it goes. That's not very good for photodynamic therapy. What you really need is something like a dimmer switch. So one of those old style switches where you can tone the intensity of the light. And that's exactly what our device does. And it's that careful balance between too much and too little. If you get that precisely right, you know you can target your viral or bacterial membrane based on a simple surface area to volume ratio.
Great, thank you. I hope that answers the question. Chris, do you want to go on to the next one?
Yeah, so we've got quite a few on here with a lot of votes for Eddie. So Eddie, we've got, so broad spectrum antiviral therapies are the holy grail in the field. So what do you, and to be honest, I suppose anyone in the audience can answer this, what are the real roadblocks to developing those therapies?
Yeah, that's a good question. When we say broad spectrum, we have to say within the coronavirus family. I think if you were trying to get compounds that basically cross over to viruses such as Ebola, for example, that's too big a jump. And in fact, that's one of my criticisms of the one drug that's shown some modest effect, which is a drug called remdesivir, which is a Gilead drug. It's a nucleoside analog. It was developed for Hep C. Then it was shown to be active against Ebola and then MERS. It's not very potent against SARS-CoV-2. And it does have some toxicity. So that's the sort of profile you don't want. If you go too broad, you'll reduce potency and you will start to induce off-target effects. That's how it's working. But within the coronavirus family, the way you can achieve this is by using the most conserved functions. And the most conserved function will be the polymerase. It's about 99% conserved between the coronavirus family. So that gives you more chance of getting a broad activity. But I have to confess to you, I think if we drive potency too hard, we will end up with more and more potent molecules, but they'll be more specific against coronavirus, individual coronaviruses. So we have to accept the fact it's going to be, I've just had a present brought to me. There's a bottle of beer. So if you drive potency too hard, you'll end up with a very selective inhibitor against one individual coronavirus. We're looking for perhaps weaker inhibitors, but cheap. We want these to be cheap so they can be stockpiled, particularly in, sort of Africa, Southeast Asia. And we want them to be active against a broad panel of coronaviruses. We're not there, Chris. It's a long way to go. Drug discovery takes a long time.
Very interesting. And just a follow-up for you as well, because we're talking about antiviral drugs. You mentioned the Hep C drug was quite profitable for your company before. Why is it that pharmaceutical companies are seeing these as unprofitable then? I believe you mentioned that as well in your presentation, didn't you?
Hep C, of course, is a virus that infects used to infect huge numbers of people. And ultimately, they either had to have a liver transplant or they died. So to be candid with you, companies could charge premium prices for that. So the Gilead compound used to cost around about £40,000 or dollars for a treatment, but they cured. So if you had Hep C and you were destined to have a liver transplant or die, with the Gilead compound, you were cured. Same with the compound I worked on. So that's the proposition. Unfortunately, again, if you look at something like Egypt, about 60% of the Egyptian population are infected with hepatitis C. And of course, they can't afford these drugs. And that's a major problem, is how do we basically make drugs which are cheap enough to be used in a wider population, which is what we're trying to do with coronavirus. We're trying to make them cheap if we can.
Well, thank you.
Eddie, continuing with your theme, especially when you mentioned China, some papers claim that SARS-CoV-2 circulation in Europe, especially in Italy and Spain, was already there in the autumn of 2019. What do you say to that?
The data is starting to mount up that it might have been in there. And I know there's a data found in the sewage farms in Italy, which was around about the end of 2019. It said there was some coronavirus nucleic acid there. And then more recently, there was a study done in Italy where they looked at lung transplant patients. They've been studying for a completely different reason. They had a collection of blood samples, and that was in, I think, September last year. I think I might get the month wrong, but September, October time. And they went back and looked there, and they found an immune response against SARS-CoV-2 in those samples. Now, I haven't seen the paper, and what I would say to anyone who basically wants to really study COVID, I think it's been the worst area for people to publish absolute crap. There's so much stuff that is so badly wrong. And if you want to look at one of the worst papers, look at the first paper out of the Lyon group in France about the chlorohydroxyquinine. Absolute garbage. However, you've got to basically just filter it a little bit. The data is starting to mount up. I wouldn't be surprised if it was seen in Europe much earlier. That probably means it was in China a little bit earlier as well.
Great, thank you. So the next question here is for Sagar. So with privacy being a big issue with all these apps, how do you reassure your users that their movements will not be tracked or are scared of having their movements tracked?
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, that was a really big point for us. So firstly, the app operates completely offline. So once you download it, you don't transmit any data back to a server. So the only thing that happens is you can, if you want to, send feedback on the associated app store. And that's the first port of call. I think it's the collecting of data that can be the issue for a lot of us. I hate it when I get an email from a random sender. The other side of it is on the Bluetooth. The Bluetooth information that we use, anyone can get is if you just scan for a Bluetooth device, a bit like when you want to pair a new set of headphones or speakers. That list is just being transferred onto a format where we can use it to range location. So there's no change in, for instance, Bluetooth information, and then there's no sign up. And they're the two forms of information that could be transmitted on these devices. And we avoid that by not touching it effectively. And hopefully we hope that even with the software innovation that nobody tries to use the same concept and then kind of try and steal data. But it'd be very difficult to do it via Bluetooth, but the sign-up is one of the biggest things, and we just want to avoid that altogether.
Great, thank you.
And for you again, Sagar, is there, obviously because the idea of your app is that it's going to be speaking to other devices, albeit in a secure manner, is there a critical mass of people that you need to be using this before it starts being useful? Do you see it being more useful in places like cities as opposed to rural areas?
That's a really good point. So we did initially think that if we wanted it to work, we'd need everyone to be using the same application, but provided a person has Bluetooth, it becomes somewhat useful. So whether you have your Bluetooth on, and a lot of devices, particularly, the reason why I mention Apple a lot is because we test a lot with them, is they have something called low energy Bluetooth. So you could turn your Bluetooth off so you don't connect to your, for instance, speakers or home devices, but you'd still get picked up on somebody's app. In that term, it's quite useful. When we're talking about critical mass in terms of in the rural area, we didn't expect as much, we didn't expect it to be as used as much, purely because these areas don't see the same footfall. If we look at the congestion and almost at the sort of movement of people, they tend to not congregate as they would in a city. Public transport, for instance, even waiting for public transport, you'd stand quite close if it's raining under a bus shelter. These are sort of situations which we really focused on and saw as quite high risk potentials for spreading a potential disease. And that's what we kind of focused on it. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, essentially what you're saying is it scales with, there will be more people using it in the places that it needs to be used. It kind of naturally works, doesn't it?
That's the goal.
Yeah, thank you. Alistair, I was quite keen to talk to you actually. You said your co-founder was or is an engineer. I'm also an engineer, so I have to agree that what he was talking about is the more important part, clearly. But it was really clear in what you were doing that there's the clear definition between what he did and what you did, in terms of like there's the biomedically type stuff and the clunky engineering stuff. Were there any real issues you had between the two of you though, sort of where you clashed and you started having to push and pull a little bit in order to sort of get the right product at the end?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really important point. If you present biologists and engineers into the same room to get a solution to the same problem, they'll come out with different answers. There's definitely things, particularly around some of the LEDs and sensors we use. We have to take into consideration the biology, but also the engineering aspects. And I think this is about how do you work in an interdisciplinary environment. I think that's really about breaking down barriers. So particularly for us, some of the common acronyms I would use, Chris won't understand, but some of the real basic engineering principles, he says to me, and I just say, look, I don't understand what you're talking about. I think that's a really important point. Saying I don't understand sometimes can be seen with a little bit of a defense mechanism, whereas actually I think it's really important, and to get everyone sort of speaking a common language, again, is really, really important. And I think it goes into building a longevity of device. For Eddie's drugs that he's developing, I'm sure he'll look into how the manufacturing works. So is it cheap to manufacture? How do we get that done? How do we get it distributed? Same for the biology. You've got to think about the engineering in terms of, can it be scaled? Can it be built properly? How do we test this? And yeah, definitely there were some tricky moments between us.
Glad to pull through with it.
Alistair, continuing on that, as we know, COVID-19 has been reported to affect different tissues in the body. Are there any other, uses for your light-sensitive drugs to be reached to hearts or liver tissues instead, or as well?
Yeah, so some of the nice thing about some of these drugs is they're given orally, so they're actually get a systemic response. So we're not the first people to think of photodynamic therapy for antiviral or antibacterial applications. You'll look all the way back, you can actually get treatments for acne using photodynamic therapy. The important thing is how good is the device at delivering the therapy, and how sensitive is it to stopping those side effects we talked about earlier on. But yes, I think there's a really growing area in fluorescent dyes coming through oncology as well. So this technology is not just applicable to COVID-19. It's really going forward to oncology, wound care, etc. It's got implications going forward.
Awesome. And a follow-up to that, have you tested the phototherapy in any animal models or in any in vivo clinical trials?
I would love to. If anyone's got a spare about £400,000 or £500,000, we've got to do this to get this tested in the lungs. Because of the size of the device and we're going for a human market, you need to do this in quite a large scale animal model. So it's not as easy as doing it in a rat or a mouse. But that's really the next stage that we go on to for sort of designing those experiments to basically prove how we can get have an effect on these patients. Because it's one thing to clear the virus, it's another thing to have a clinical effect. So to get people on ventilators quicker, we maybe won't know until we actually get to the clinical stage, because designing a study in animal models, it's very difficult, for example, to ventilate a larger animal. So really you want to think about, okay, yes, I'm having the effect of the antiviral effect, but what's my end clinical goal? What am I trying to get so it actually has a benefit for the patient? But yeah, we'd love to. Let me know. I'll let you know when we get investment going forward.
Great, thank you. Eddie, a quick question for you. So as you mentioned, a few viruses and pandemics of the past, is there any one in particular that you're worried about going into the future?
Well, I referred you to a virus called Nipah, although people pronounce it differently. Being from Liverpool, I call it Nipah. There's another virus which is called Four Corners virus, and people can Google this. The background for this is absolutely horrendous. It's in the States, where four of the states meet together. There's a Native American population around there. And it's an anecdote, well, it's a true story about a couple who went up into the hills, cleared out a cabin up in the hills, as you do beginning of summer, to start living up there during the summer. Swept it. It's in mouse feces. On the way down from that cabin, the bloke felt ill. By the time he got down to the town below, he felt so ill. His partner had to drive. She had to drive him to the hospital. He was dead on arrival at the hospital. She died the next day. They died within about 48 hours of being up in that cabin. So again, that's because they aerosolized it and they inhaled it and they got a big viral load. But even so, there are viruses which basically are very, very pathogenic. But I think sometimes we all think of these viruses and we think of humans, but I think of some of the diseases now of in agriculture, which I think is equally concerning about some of the, not just viruses, but the fungi infecting some of our staple food crops and staple environmental plants and trees. They start to worry me even more and more. Same problem. Don't catch Nipah.
Well, keep in mind.
Yes, there's another one coming for you, Eddie, which I think is quite an interesting one, actually. We've heard a lot about, a lot of positive stuff about vaccines being developed and looking quite likely that they'll work. When we think about the reputation of Big Pharma and a lot of the misinformation around vaccines, do we see there being any issues with the uptake of the vaccine? And to be fair, this could be addressed to any of you as well, if you've got opinions on it.
Sure. I think, unfortunately, the answer to that's going to be yes. Now, let's face it, there's the silver foil hat brigade, who basically won't take any vaccine, any reason, and try and persuade everyone not to take it. But I think there's a more reasonable group of people who are somewhat nervous about how these vaccines evolve. I think it's unfortunate because I think that's misplaced. You know, if you look at HIV, when I joined the industry when HIV just emerged about 5 years later, and we went from people dying within 2 years, minimum 6 months to 2 years. Now they take one tablet a day and their life expectancy is exactly the same as anyone else. That came out of industry. You know, that wasn't some nasty company. But of course, industry's there to make profits, but it came out of industry. I think any of us now today who are a bit happier than we were 2 weeks ago before this vaccine news came out are you know, strange people. We're all feeling a bit happier. I'm a little bit surprised that the mRNA vaccines worked as well as they did. They've never really worked that well in other diseases so far. That's a great relief to us all. At least it's a proof of concept. My feeling, however, is because this cold chain, it'll, even in countries like the UK, it's going to make them difficult to be used. And of course, again, going back outside the UK to Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, you know, the idea of basically storing a virus at -70 is just nonsense. So it's the next generation vaccines. Maybe the adeno ones are coming out, which may be more stable, may give a stronger immune response. That's the ones I'd be very interested in. I think it's a great story. I think the industry has responded very, very well. Yes, we're motivated by profit. We have shareholders, investors to make profits. That's the line. But actually, the industry has produced vaccines within months when new disease been discovered. That's a tremendous achievement.
Thank you. And Alistair or Scar, did you have any opinions on that at all? You can say no. I'll take those as no's. But I think these ones would.
No, I think Eddie covered it. Eddie covered it really well there.
Yeah, in that case, I think this one might be quite applicable to all three of you. As we start to see these vaccines hopefully start to work, and let's say that they are quite effective, are we going to see a change or a shift in the way the industry is directed in terms of monitoring and detecting? Are we going to move away from that to the next stage, or are we going to see these being consistently important, especially if there's the fear of future pandemics potentially around the corner, Eddie, as you were alluding to?
I prefer to hand over to my colleagues, so I think I've dominated the whole conversation. I'll come in at the end.
I mean, as these guys have said, with more potential pandemics on the horizon, I think this is a pandemic that's hit a very westernized culture. The UK, we saw it on the news and we didn't think it would affect us, and then after Christmas it was a big hit, and I think that's going to spur on the drive towards disease prevention, and particularly diseases that can affect any and all age groups. It's not just those sort of niche diseases, and it could crop up again. And this is where I think there needs to be technology in place and systems out, like Alistair is talking about, treatments that are far more effective. Whether you can vaccinate is one thing, but being able to treat in the right way is really important. And I'd see a big push towards that, as we don't know what's around the corner, as COVID-19 showed us.
Yeah, I completely agree with those sentiments, particularly how this has hit the economy and changed our every day of life. You're going to remember this time from pre and post pandemic. When I'm 60, 70 odd, if I make it that far, is I'll be telling my grandchildren potentially about the time beforehand we didn't have to wash our hands. This is going to be ingrained in our memory, and I hope that does come through in a government shift as well as a investment shift as well. I think not just in treatments like we're producing, but things like apps to help with reducing community-acquired pneumonia. Still in the UK, 3,000 people die each year from community-acquired pneumonia. Yes, the population of that is particularly elderly, but young people do get predisposed to this. Anything we can do to make the population more healthy, whether it's cycling, whether it's better uptake of vaccines, should be a priority. I hope that is taken forward in the future, maybe perhaps by the burnt remains of COVID-19.
Yep, the only thing I would add to that is just a tale of the fact that in this country of people who are eligible and should be taking flu vaccine, only about half of them do. About 50% of people a year who should be taking a vaccine take it. And the current flu vaccine is only about 50% effective. My guess is that we'll go for a period where COVID will not disappear magically during 2021. Hopefully, it'll be reduced to the point where we can all get on with our lives, but it might look a little bit like the flu, not pandemics, but the seasonal flu that we get, where there'll be outbreaks in nursing homes and in other environments. And again, we'll need to have rapid diagnostics, ways of handling it, monitoring it, that actually will allow us to bring either vaccine supply to protect populations nearby, but also drugs that basically can be used to treat those populations. So I think we'll end at a different phase and starting in 2021, rolling out of learning to live a little bit with a low grade infection. But we still have to handle that.
A follow-up to that, Eddie, and I think Sagar, you could also chip into this. So different countries have been handling the pandemic better or worse. How and why do you think that is?
I've got a very good answer there. The countries that have done really well, the Southeast Asian countries, they were the countries that got we didn't have much SARS, but it was largely confined to Southeast Asia and Canada, funny enough, in Toronto. Those countries that got the big hit from SARS, such as it was, are the ones that really got scared and were really, really ready for when SARS-CoV-2 came out. They were ready. As soon as it came out, they reacted very, very quickly. And you'd say perhaps the more sort of authoritarian or compliant populations followed what the government said. There was another survey, not great science, but what they said was they studied Europe and they studied all the different variations of lockdown we've had. What factor was linked to countries like Germany, which coped very well, to countries like the UK, which is a complete mess? And actually, what's funny was it had nothing to do with what measure you brought in. It was how quickly you applied those measures. Those countries that reacted fairly quickly were the ones that controlled the COVID, and that's what they did. Whatever lockdown they did, whatever restrictions, and that's what we've seen. We were very slow to lock down in the first wave, and we've been slow again for the second time, and that's where we get. But the Southeast Asian countries did a superb job, and of course it's a pity we didn't use the South Korean app to trace. Instead, we have to go off and make our own. Pity we just didn't simply pick one off the shelf, which was being offered to us, and get on with it.
Thank you, Sagar. Do you have anything to add to that?
I tend to agree quite a lot with Eddie. I think one of the issues in some of this, I'd say, I think with countries where you have this concept of personal freedom a lot of the time, you don't like that idea of being told what to do. You question when you see somebody else outside sort of mingling, you feel like you're missing out. I know it's a bit, but it's not necessarily the most commonly scientific term, but FOMO, fear of missing out. I think that can have a heavy impact, and you justify it by maybe skating the rules slightly. Even now, it's difficult. You might go to the office. I'm at a hospital sometimes where I will see a lot of people, and you notice that there are breaches in the guidelines, and that's what they are. They're guidelines, not really always that enforced. And as Eddie said, it's sometimes this sort of, maybe I'm wrong, but it's a liberal approach to a problem which does sometimes require a bit more of a stricter hand, and I'd say that's been the biggest problem in some more of the more Western countries. But yeah, I do tend to agree with Eddie. If we'd followed suit to some of the other sort of options out there, and again, we've not been hit by something like this, at least in our generation. Well, my generation, I can't remember a time where I've had to isolate and follow a curfew per se. So I think that's the other side of it as well.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, just one other comment. It's really interesting around your question. Japan got hit with a big flu epidemic in the 1950s, which actually killed a lot of people and had caused them a lot of trouble. And after that, there was a general common practice to wear masks. And people often get this mistaken. It wasn't because you were trying to prevent yourselves from becoming infected. It was because you were trying to stop infecting other people. So that became culturally ingrained in the Japanese population to wear masks when you were ill. We didn't get that. So again, some of these countries were prepared far better than we've ever been. British are just awkward.
Well, thank you for that. So a more general question towards all of you. Eddie, you've managed and been CEO of many companies. Sagar, you've started your own med startup while working as a dentist. And Alistair, you also have started your own company. So for the participants of the seminar, do you have any advice on how to get into the biotech sector and how to start your own startup?
For a startup, particularly resilience. So you're probably going to hear lots of times no. You're going to feel like you've hit rock bottom at some times, but other times you're going to feel like you're on top of the world. Particularly for running an early stage startup, I'd say it's a little bit like what I imagine, I can't really put words on it, but being a little bit like a bipolar disorder. I don't have a good day in the office or a medium day. I have exceptional, or I have the worst day so far. There is really no in between. And I think for that, you need to make sure you've got resilience, being able to prepare for things like this and take on advice, even if you don't want to hear it. So there's one thing within these four walls, everything I say echoes and I hear it back to myself. What I really need to do is go and speak to people who have different opinions to me to make sure that I can hear their arguments and make sure that we're really developing something that we've taken all the expertise in. But my one piece of advice really for myself would be, for me, get a bike, go lots of cycling. When you do have those bad days in the office, I'm often around Richmond Park for an hour, 40 minutes, trying to burn off some energy.
Good advice.
I mean, from my side, it's so I've always been a big believer in taking opportunities and taking chances on when an opportunity comes knocking. So I'm also doing my PhD now, and I think that's been the biggest door opener for learning about how to think differently. You'll meet so many interesting people, and don't necessarily dismiss somebody when they say something. It may not be solid advice, but a lot of people will be able to help you along the way for trying to start something. They may know somebody who can help you. And ultimately, I think try not to go it alone. Try and have somebody who complements what you can do. So in this case, a bit like Alistair, my partner Divya, she's a technologist. She studied electrical and electronic engineering, and there I am with dentistry. So they're very different sort of subjects, but you can bring them together and look for that. Look for things that are different, and then try and solve a problem, and you'll probably find that other people have that problem as well.
Yeah,
thank you.
Alistair and Saga gave great answers. I couldn't beat them. I think they've done something I haven't, which is started right from scratch. But what I would say is definitely do it. If you think you've got a good idea that you really believe in, don't hold back, do it. Because it is, take Alistair's point, it can be so exciting. When it's good, it's very, very good. The other thing I'd say is being a CEO is a very lonely place to be. That sounds like, weeping. I'm sure everyone will be weeping for me, but it isn't. It can be very unpleasant. It can be quite lonely. Always find someone, that you can talk to openly and confide in. Let out a bit of steam, have a bit of a rant at. So then you get back on and start again. So always have someone you can talk to. Don't isolate yourself, because that can be a very bad thing to do.
Great. I think that's some great advice for everyone listening. Thank you.
I think this next question might pull a bit of advice out as well, actually. So Sagar, you are doing your PhD at the same time as running the startup, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So basically, how do you juggle that? How do you handle that home work-life balance? And what advice do you have for anyone that might consider doing the same thing?
To be honest, it's this is just my experience. I do like waking up early. I'd say try and wake up by 5:30, 6 o'clock. Get in early, and you should be excited about whatever you're doing. If you're excited, you'll wake up for it. So that means you instantly have more time anyway, and you'll think about it. So a bit like Alistair, I like cycle. I cycle into university. It's about 30 minutes. I can think. I talk to my dad a lot, who's pretty good as a mentor, and I vent to him a lot about these things, and also my friends. But in terms of balancing it, I'd say the other side of it is you need to know when to switch off as well. Working all the time isn't the answer. It's my friends have also told me this. It's about switching off and having time to have a bit of downtime, and that's okay. Being forgiving to yourself at that point. But the key to it, I think, is being excited about what you do. You'll wake up early. You'll go to bed late and happily do it, and that's the main thing. And just go for it. As Eddie said, just you'll have a cracking time in that process.
Thank you. You can really hear the passion when you talk about that. It's really nice to hear. And then a really quick one for you, actually. It might be a quick answer. When's the app available?
So actually, we're in a cycle of review with Apple. So we're hoping, we were actually hoping to have it out for this event. I'm hoping it's out before Christmas. That's the goal. And as soon as it is, we'll let everyone know. We'll just want to make sure it's not flawless. It's going to have some issues, but we want to make sure it delivers on what we said it's going to deliver. And still a couple of bugs. So I'd say before Christmas is the dream, is the goal. And I think we're probably going to hit that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So yeah, I think those are the questions that we had. Thank you so much, for your answers and for your time. And I'm going to pass it over to Sophie.